The house was buzzing with that familiar kind of warmth that only a family gathering could bring. The scent of homemade food lingered in the air, and I could hear the faint laughter of my cousins coming from the kitchen as they joked about something that was probably ridiculous, like always. It should have been a day full of celebration, but something was gnawing at me. It wasn't just the fact that I'd barely slept the night before, trying to come up with the perfect birthday gift for Aunt Carol. It was more about this strange tension that had been hanging over me for weeks now, building up like a storm cloud, waiting for the right moment to burst. I stood in the corner of the living room, trying to act casual, but my heart was pounding. My hands trembled slightly as I clenched my phone, the screen lighting up with a notification that meant nothing. I couldn't take my eyes off the gift I'd carefully wrapped in silver paper sitting on the coffee table. It was a framed photograph of the family, taken years ago during a trip to the lake, when things felt simpler. The smiles we wore were real back then, before the drama, before the tensions that seemed to bubble up every time Carol was involved. I thought maybe this would make her happy. I thought it was sentimental enough to get a genuine reaction. But as soon as Aunt Carol walked into the room, everything shifted. She was the kind of person who had to be the center of attention, and she did it without even trying. It was just who she was. Dressed in her usual dramatic style, her hair styled just so, and that ever-present look of slight discontent on her face, like nothing was ever quite enough. Her eyes scanned the room, landing on me for a brief moment, and I quickly turned my gaze away. "Let's get this over with," she said, her voice sharp, almost as if the entire celebration was a chore. She sat down in the armchair, crossing her arms over her chest, waiting. She always did this, made everyone wait for her, like she was some kind of queen. I took a deep breath and handed her the gift. My palms were sweaty as she slowly unwrapped the silver paper, her eyes not meeting mine. I felt a knot in my stomach tighten as she opened the frame. She stared at it for a moment, her eyes flicking back and forth, as if trying to find something wrong with it. I could feel my pulse racing as I watched her face for any sign of emotion, anything that would tell me I'd done something right. Her lips curled into a thin smile, but it was empty, like she was just pretending to be pleased. "This isn't what I wanted," she said flatly, setting the frame down on the table. Her words hit me harder than I expected. They stung more than they should have, and I felt a strange mixture of embarrassment and anger rising inside me. For a moment, I just stood there, unsure of how to react. The room seemed to freeze, the cheerful chatter from earlier now muted, as if the walls themselves had held their breath. I could feel the weight of my family's gaze on me. I wanted to sink into the floor and disappear. Before I could respond, my sister Emma, who had been sitting on the other side of the room with that ever-calm, almost detached look on her face, spoke up. "You're lucky you got anything at all," she said, her voice cool, but I could hear the edge to it. The room went completely still, and for a second, I thought the world had stopped turning. Emma, always the one to bite her tongue, had just thrown down the gauntlet. I watched as Aunt Carol's face twisted in shock, then quickly shifted to annoyance. She opened her mouth to retort, but nothing came out. My stomach churned. I wasn't sure if I should be relieved or terrified. Emma never held back, but this felt different. There was something more cutting in her tone, something that felt like it was coming from a place of years of frustration, years of trying to please someone who would never be happy. And then, as if the tension wasn't thick enough, Emma leaned forward and slid a small, neatly folded envelope onto the table, directly in front of Aunt Carol. Everything felt like it was happening in slow motion. My breath caught in my chest as Aunt Carol, still stunned from Emma's remark, reached for the envelope. I saw her hand tremble slightly, but she quickly masked it with a scoff. For some reason, I knew what was coming next, but I couldn't look away. My heart hammered in my chest, and I could almost hear the blood rushing to my ears as Aunt Carol slowly pulled out the letter. Inside, the silence in the room was suffocating. Every single pair of eyes was locked on Aunt Carol as she unfolded the piece of paper, her fingers shaking ever so slightly. I could feel my own heartbeat thumping in my ears, the sound so loud I thought everyone else could hear it. I glanced around the room, looking at my cousins and uncles, all of them with their eyes wide, mouths slightly agape, unsure of what to do. It was like we were all waiting for a bomb to explode. Aunt Carol's face went from confusion to disbelief in a split second. She stared at the letter, her eyes narrowing as if the words on the page were written in some foreign language. I could see the muscles in her neck tighten, her skin growing paler with each second that passed. But there was something else, something that flickered in her eyes as she glanced up at Emma, something I couldn't quite place. What was she thinking? I couldn't understand. How could she be so caught off guard? Had she really not seen this coming? Or was she pretending to be innocent, hoping that none of us would dare challenge her? Aunt Carol let out a small, strained laugh, but it wasn't genuine. It was the kind of laugh that people use when they're caught off guard but don't want to admit it. What is this? What are you trying to pull here, Emma? Her voice trembled ever so slightly as she spoke. Emma didn't respond immediately. She just sat there, calm and collected, her arms crossed, watching Carol with a cold detachment. It was almost as if she had been waiting for this moment her entire life. The weight of it all hung in the air, and I felt like I was watching something far bigger than just a birthday gift exchange. My stomach churned. I didn't know what to feel anymore. Was I relieved? Scared? Proud of Emma for standing up to Carol? Or did I feel guilty for being a passive spectator in the chaos that had just unfolded? I was so caught up in my own whirlwind of emotions that it took me a moment to realize Aunt Carol hadn't said anything for what felt like forever. I could see her fingers clutching the paper tightly, her knuckles turning white. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The room held its breath. I could feel the tension thickening, almost suffocating. It was as if we were all bracing for impact, and none of us knew just how bad it was going to be. And then Aunt Carol finally spoke. Her voice was a strangled whisper. "You can't be serious." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and ominous. Her eyes, wide and frantic, met Emma's, but instead of the usual arrogance or contempt, there was something else. Something that looked like fear. Fear. That's what it was. Aunt Carol, the woman who always seemed to be in control, who had always used her sharp words and sharp gaze to manipulate everyone around her, was scared. It wasn't something I had ever seen in her before. I had always thought she was untouchable, a force of nature. But now, as she stood there, fumbling for her words, she seemed small, fragile even. Emma didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She just stared back at Aunt Carol, her gaze steady and unwavering. The tension in the room was so thick you could practically cut it with a knife. And still, no one spoke. Everyone just waited for Carol to break, for the mask to slip. My mind was spinning. I had always been the one to stay out of family conflicts, the one who didn't rock the boat. But now, seeing Emma so calmly take control of the situation, I realized just how much I had underestimated her. She was the one who was tired of being passive. She was the one who had finally had enough. And now, for the first time in a long time, It felt like she was the one who had the upper hand. As Aunt Carol's face contorted in disbelief, her mouth opening and closing like she was trying to form the words to make this all go away, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of guilt and awe. I didn't know what was coming next, but one thing was certain. Nothing in this family would ever be the same again. The room felt like it was holding its breath, suspended in time, as Aunt Carol just stood there, staring at the letter in her hands. Her face was a shade of red that I'd never seen before, her jaw clenched so tightly I thought her teeth might crack. She blinked a few times, as though trying to convince herself that what she was reading wasn't real, but the words were clear, and there was no denying what they meant. "You're out of the will." Those 4 words echoed in my head, louder than any noise in the room. It was as though the walls themselves had absorbed the shockwave of Emma's declaration, and now everything felt distorted, warped. Aunt Carol's grip on the letter tightened, her knuckles white, but she didn't speak. She just stood there, frozen, her eyes flicking rapidly between the letter and Emma, who was still sitting there with that unsettling calm. I watched as Carol's lips trembled, a mixture of disbelief and anger bubbling just beneath the surface. Her fingers shook so violently now that it was almost as if she were physically unable to process what was happening. She opened her mouth again, but the words that came out were barely a whisper. "This isn't real. This isn't happening," she muttered, her voice wavering with panic. My heart was pounding in my chest, the pulse in my ears loud and insistent. I felt my palms sweat, my hands clammy against the cool surface of the coffee table. It wasn't just the shock of what Emma had done. It was the weight of everything that had led up to this moment. I had always known Carol's behavior was toxic, but I had never imagined it would come to this. The room was still, every single person present waiting for Carol to explode. I could feel the tension coiling in the air, thick and tight, ready to snap. No one dared move or speak, as if breaking the silence would somehow make the whole thing feel more real. Emma didn't flinch. She didn't even look remotely concerned about Carol's reaction. Her arms were still crossed, her posture relaxed, as if she had been prepared for this moment long before the rest of us had even begun to understand what was happening. I glanced at Emma, trying to read her face, but it was impossible. She was unreadable, calm, almost detached. Aunt Carol's breathing was ragged now, a sharp, uneven rhythm that matched the frantic thoughts swirling in my own mind. What had just happened? How had we gone from a simple birthday party to this emotional maelstrom? Why had Emma done this? Why had she chosen now, of all times, to pull the rug out from under Carol's feet? And then, in an almost inaudible voice, Aunt Carol said something that made the blood drain from my face. "You have no idea what you've done, do you?" Her words were cold, and they hit me like a slap. There was no warmth left in her tone, no trace of the woman I thought I knew. She looked at Emma, her gaze sharp and piercing, like she was trying to find something, anything to hold on to. Emma didn't flinch. She didn't back down. In fact, I could almost see her muscles relax, like she had just finished something long overdue, something that had been building up for far too long. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but the rest of her body language was eerily calm. "I know exactly what I'm doing," Emma replied, her voice steady and quiet. But there was an undeniable edge to it now. "You've been manipulating this family for years, Carol, and today, it stops." My stomach churned again. I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of admiration for Emma's bravery and guilt for not being the one to say something sooner. I had always been the passive one, the one who tried to smooth things over, but now I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. What Emma was saying, what she had just done, It was long overdue. I looked around the room, desperate for some kind of support, but it was clear that everyone was just as stunned as I was. No one dared speak, not even a murmur of agreement or concern. Carol's eyes widened in horror as she processed Emma's words, her mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. I watched her chest rise and fall with quick, shallow breaths. She was unraveling before our eyes, her fortress of control crumbling away. The tension in the room was unbearable now, like the space itself was holding its breath, waiting for Carol to finally lose it. And she did. With a shaky breath, Carol snapped, her voice rising, her fury finally breaking free. "You think you can just—" She stopped, the words choking in her throat. She looked at the letter in her hands once more, like she was willing it to change, like she could somehow erase the damage that had already been done. But it was too late. The room had changed. The air was thick with something dark and palpable now, something that had been simmering under the surface for years. The confrontation had begun, and there was no turning back. I could see the room shifting, like the tension was a living, breathing thing, creeping along the walls and sinking into everyone's bones. Aunt Carol was still standing there, her face red with anger, eyes wild with disbelief. She opened her mouth again, but the words didn't come out. She was sputtering, shaking her head like she couldn't process the reality of what had just happened. For a brief moment, it felt like time had frozen. I was frozen. My body felt heavy, like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't escape. I had never seen Carol so vulnerable, so human. I guess in a way, that made her scarier. The powerful, untouchable Aunt Carol I had grown up with, her perfect, manipulative smile, was nowhere to be found. She was unraveling in front of us, and the person who was unraveling wasn't someone I recognized. Then, as if on cue, Emma stood up. The sudden movement broke the stillness in the room, and all eyes turned to her. She didn't speak for a moment, just stood there, her arms still crossed, but her face was hard, her jaw set. I felt a strange sense of calm wash over her, like she was in complete control of the situation, and it only made the unease in my chest grow more intense. "Do you know why I did it?" Emma asked, her voice breaking through the chaos in a low, cutting tone. Aunt Carol's eyes flicked to Emma, her hands trembling, the letter still clutched tightly in her fingers. But she didn't answer. She didn't have an answer. I could feel my heart racing. I didn't know what Emma was planning, but I could see the fire in her eyes, the determination that had been building up in her for years. I had always seen her as the cool-headed one, the one who held things together when everything seemed to fall apart. But now, I realized she wasn't just holding things together. She was about to shatter everything. The rest of the family seemed to be caught in the same strange, suffocating silence. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. Everyone was too caught up in the drama unfolding before us. And then it hit me. Emma wasn't just standing up to Aunt Carol for the sake of standing up. She was doing it for all of us, for me, for Mom, for Dad, for everyone who had silently tolerated Carol's toxic presence for far too long. We had all been too afraid to say anything, too afraid to stand up to her. But Emma had finally snapped. She had taken the decision out of our hands, and now there was no going back. I watched as Emma took a deep breath, her eyes locking with Carol's, unwavering. "You've controlled this family for far too long," she said, her voice a little louder now, stronger. "You've manipulated everyone here, and we've all just let you do it. But not anymore." I could see the impact of her words land on Carol like a punch to the gut. Aunt Carol's face twisted in frustration, a flicker of fear in her eyes as she tried to muster some kind of defense, but it was too late. The truth was out, and there was no hiding from it anymore. I felt a shift inside me, a strange sense of empowerment mixed with guilt. For so long, I had been on the sidelines, watching Emma bear the brunt of the family's problems, watching as she quietly endured the tension, the manipulation, the subtle cruelty that Carol had inflicted on all of us. But now, Emma was finally taking control. She wasn't going to let Carol walk away from this. My mind was racing, but I knew one thing for sure. This was a defining moment. There was no going back from this. Not for Aunt Carol, and not for us. It was like a dam had burst open, and we were all being swept away by the flood. I couldn't stop staring at Emma. The intensity in her eyes was a mixture of pain and resolve, as if this moment had been building up inside her for years. She wasn't just confronting Carol. She was confronting everything that had been wrong in our family for far too long. And then, without warning, Emma reached down and picked up the letter from the table, the one that had shattered the calm of the room. She looked at it for a moment, her gaze flicking from the letter to Aunt Carol before she spoke again. "Do you understand what this means, Carol?" Emma's voice was low, but it carried through the silence, heavy with finality. "This isn't just about a gift. This isn't just about today. This is about everything that's led up to this moment. You've pushed us all too far, and now it's over." I didn't know what was going to happen next, but I could feel the room shift again. The weight of the moment settled heavily on my chest, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one trying to hold everything together. I wasn't the one trying to keep the peace. It was Emma, and she had made her choice. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in as Emma's words hung heavy in the air. "It's over." The finality of it rang through the space like a bell, and even Aunt Carol, who had always been the one to control every situation, couldn't argue. She had no words left. I watched as Aunt Carol's expression faltered, her defenses crumbling like a tower of cards. She glanced down at the letter once more, her eyes scanning the words like she was looking for an escape, some way to rewrite the reality that had been thrust upon her. But there was no escape. No way out of this. For a long moment, she just stood there, her mouth slightly open, her body rigid, like she was a statue carved from shock and disbelief. Her face was pale, and her usual air of superiority had melted into something raw and vulnerable. It was a side of her I'd never seen before, a side that didn't fit with the aunt I'd grown up fearing, the aunt who had always made us bend to her will, who had always turned every situation in her favor. I could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on me now. I wasn't sure what to do or where to look. I wasn't sure if I should step in or say something, but a strange sense of calm had settled over me. Emma had made her decision. She had drawn the line, and there was no turning back. Aunt Carol's hands began to tremble, her fingers twitching with anger as she finally found her voice again. "You can't do this," she whispered, barely audible. You can't just throw me out like this. I'm your family. I'm the one who's always been there for you." Her words were desperate, but they were weak. She wasn't commanding the room anymore. She wasn't the one who had the power. The power had shifted, and she could feel it. I could see it in the way she tried to hold herself together, her shoulders shaking, her lips quivering. The calm Emma had shown earlier now transformed into a quiet fury. "You've always thought you could control us, Carol, but this is the line. You've crossed it too many times. And now we're done." It was like a switch had flipped in the room. Aunt Carol's desperate pleas, her attempts to regain control, fell flat. She looked at Emma like she was a different person. someone she didn't recognize. The shock on her face deepened, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. Emma didn't flinch. Her gaze was unwavering, solid. "You've hurt too many people. You've broken too many of us, and I can't keep watching you tear our family apart. It stops now." I felt a rush of emotions all at once: relief, anger, disbelief. I had always known Aunt Carol's behavior was damaging, but I had never had the courage to confront it, to stand up to it. But Emma had done it. She had called out the truth that no one had dared to speak aloud for years. Aunt Carol's face twisted, her eyes narrowing in anger, but there was nothing left in her to fight with. Her usual sharpness had dulled, her words now just the ramblings of someone who had finally been seen for what they were. "You'll regret this," she hissed, though even as she said it, her voice lacked the conviction it once had. There was no power behind the threat. I could see her crumble right before me. Aunt Carol, who had always been the source of tension and control in our family, was no longer the person we had all feared. She was just a woman who had lost everything, and the realization of it was finally hitting her. As her words hung in the air, I felt something shift deep inside me. It wasn't just that Aunt Carol was out of the will. It wasn't just about the gift or the letter. It was about the fact that Emma had finally taken a stand. She had broken the cycle. She had shown us all that it was possible to walk away from the toxic grip of someone like Carol. For a brief, powerful moment, I realized that things were never going to be the same again. The old patterns, the ones that had kept us all tangled in a web of manipulation and fear, had finally been broken. I looked around at the family. The silence that had once been deafening now felt different, more like a pause, a collective breath we were all holding. No one knew how to react, and yet there was a sense of something new unfolding in the room, something that hadn't been there before. Freedom. Aunt Carol stood there, her shoulders slumped, her mouth set in a tight line. There was nothing more to be said. The family had shifted, and we would never go back to the way things were. The air felt charged with the weight of what had just happened, and I knew, deep down, that Emma had done more than just expose Carol for who she was. She had set us all free, and no matter what happened next, none of us would ever be the same. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. No one moved, no one spoke. Aunt Carol stood there, frozen, her face contorted in disbelief, as if she couldn't quite wrap her mind around the reality of what had just happened. Her grip on the letter was white-knuckled, her whole body tense, but I could see the cracks in her facade. The woman who had always controlled the room, who had made everyone bow to her will, was broken. And yet, somehow, in that silence, there was something almost peaceful. The weight of years of pent-up frustration had been released all at once. No more pretending, no more silent compliance. It felt like we had collectively exhaled, like we could finally breathe again after holding our breath for far too long. Aunt Carol was the first to speak, though it wasn't much of a sentence. "This isn't over," she spat, but it was weak. She didn't have the same venom in her voice anymore. She knew it. We all knew it. The power she once held over us was gone. She stormed out of the room without another word, her footsteps echoing down the hallway as she left the house, probably never to return in the same way again. But as the door slammed behind her, I felt the strange sense of finality settle in. For the first time in years, I wasn't worried about how Carol would react. I wasn't worried about keeping the peace, about making sure everyone was happy. I wasn't stuck in that old, familiar cycle of anxiety and second-guessing. Emma had done the thing I had never had the courage to do. She had stood up for us all, and in doing so, she had shifted everything. As the door clicked shut, I looked around the room. It felt empty in a way, but not in the way I thought it would. The air felt lighter. There was no more tension, no more fear. Everyone was still processing what had just happened, but there was an undeniable sense of relief. I could see it in their eyes. My cousins, my uncles, even Mom and Dad, who had been caught in Carol's web just as much as anyone. Emma sat back down at the table, her arms still crossed, her expression calm. She wasn't smug or triumphant, just steady. As if this was the moment she had been waiting for, and now that it was over, there was nothing left to prove. She had done what was necessary, and it was done. I took a seat next to her, feeling a sense of calm that I hadn't experienced in years. "You didn't have to do that," I said quietly, my voice almost a whisper. Emma looked at me, her eyes softening just a fraction. Someone had to, and frankly, I couldn't watch it happen anymore. Her words hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't just that she had finally done something about Carol, it was that Emma had shown me what it meant to take control of your own life, to stop letting fear and manipulation dictate your choices. She had broken a cycle, and it wasn't just Carol who had been broken, it was all of us. We had all been living under the shadow of her control for so long, and Emma had pulled us out from under it. As the minutes passed, and the shock began to wear off, the room slowly began to fill with quiet conversation. The tension that had once gripped us had dissipated, and we were left with something else, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, our family could start fresh, that the years of fear and frustration could be left behind. In the days that followed, things shifted. There were still awkward moments, family members unsure of what to say or how to act in the aftermath of Carol's departure. But there was also a growing sense of freedom. We no longer had to tiptoe around Carol's demands. We no longer had to pretend everything was fine just to keep the peace. I realized that what Emma had done wasn't just about cutting ties with Carol. It was about reclaiming control of our lives. And as I reflected on everything that had happened, I knew that the lesson she had taught me was invaluable. Sometimes, the hardest thing to do is to say enough, to stop letting toxic people control the narrative of your life, to stand up for yourself, even when it's difficult. As for Aunt Carol, I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if we would ever speak to her again, or if she would ever try to repair the damage she'd done. But in that moment, I didn't care. Because for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had finally been set free. And no matter what the future held, I knew one thing. Things would never be the same. And maybe, just maybe, that was a good thing.